Hear ye, mortals! If this strange echo reaches you, consider yourselves chosen to hear a final truth, delivered from a rather uncomfortable vantage point. You're tuned into the Pyre prophecy, broadcasting live, or more accurately, burning live, from a very, very zealous village in the year of our Lord, insert specific year, e.g. 1589, somewhere deep in the heart of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. My name is Elara, accused witch, and if the sheer possible audacity of this transdimensional broadcast, from a moment when faith fuels fire, doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to hearing true heresy, or just good history, then frankly your soul is beyond my meager charms. Do it now, before the next wave of righteous indignation finds your doorstep, and tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange, unscourged corner of your world are you listening? What year has the witch hunter zeal decreed for you, and what hour do these desperate tidings reach you? We're taking notes for the afterlife. Now, dim your lights, lock your doors against zealous neighbors, and let's dissect the grim absurdity of the burning times. Life was simple then. Hard, yes, full of mud, hunger, and a level of personal aroma that could wilt crops, but it was a predictable kind of misery. You knew the sun would rise, the Lord would take his share, and your neighbor, old Thomas, would likely die from a particularly aggressive splinter come winter. The days were measured not by clocks, but by the aching in your back and the grumbling in your belly. We were born in mud, we worked the mud, and we were buried in mud. It was the great earthy constant in our lives, a far more reliable deity than the one they preached about on Sundays. This was our world, a tapestry woven with grit, grime, and the quiet acceptance of a short, brutish existence. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. The village of Oak Haven was a carbuncle on the backside of nowhere, a smattering of wattle and daub huts huddled together as if for warmth or protection from the vast, unnerving forests that surrounded us. Our homes leaned on each other much like we did, sharing warmth, gossip, and the occasional communicable disease. Entertainment was a rare and treasured commodity. A passing minstrel with a lute and 3 teeth was cause for a week-long celebration. A pig getting stuck in a fence could provide an entire afternoon of riveting drama. We found joy in the mundane because the alternative was to sit in the dark and contemplate the myriad ways the world was trying to kill us, from a foul humor in the blood to a disgruntled badger. Superstition was the air we breathed, thicker than the smoke from our peat fires. A spilled salt cellar was a catastrophe of the highest order. A crow flying widdershins meant someone was about to meet their maker, a prediction so frequently accurate in a village of 50 souls that it was considered gospel. We saw omens in the shape of clouds, the entrails of chickens, and the way a loaf of bread cracked in the oven. These beliefs weren't a failing, they were a comfort. They gave us a semblance of control in a world governed by plague, famine, and the whims of a distant god who seemed perpetually occupied with other more important matters than our blighted potato harvest. And in the heart of this web of ritual and fear was Elara. She wasn't a witch, not yet. Then she was simply the woman at the edge of the woods who knew things. While the priest offered prayers that often went unanswered, Elara offered poultices that actually worked. She could soothe a colicky baby with a tincture of dill water, mend a broken bone with a comfrey poultice, and brew a willow bark tea that would chase away a fever faster than a Hail Mary. We sought her out under the cloak of twilight, our faces etched with worry, our hands offering a clutch of eggs or a meager coin for her troubles. She was our secret, our remedy, the quiet magic that held the fabric of our fragile lives together. Her knowledge was a legacy, passed down from her mother, and her mother before that, a chain of wisdom stretching back into the mists of time, long before the first church spire pierced the sky. She understood the language of the green things, the secrets whispered by the wind in the reeds. She knew that foxglove, in the right measure, could steady a fluttering heart, but a fraction more could stop it entirely. This delicate balance was her art. She walked the line between healing and harm with a grace we all depended on, never once thinking that the very hands that soothed our fevers could one day be pointed to as instruments of the devil. Our fears were simpler then, more tangible. We feared the wolves that slunk from the tree line on winter nights, their howls a promise of violence. We feared the blight that could turn a promising field black in a single cursed week. We feared the Lord Steward, a man whose heart was as barren as his master's least fertile pasture. You could see them, sometimes you could even fight them. They were monsters of the physical world, not the phantom spectres that would soon crawl from the fevered minds of preachers and inquisitors, turning neighbor against neighbor and trust to ash. Life was governed by a rhythm of seasons, a cycle of toil and small rewards. Spring was for planting and praying the late frosts wouldn't kill the shoots. Summer was for the back-breaking work of the hay harvest under a relentless sun. Autumn brought the frantic rush to gather the crops, a race against the coming cold. And winter. Winter was the great test, a time of darkness, of huddling close to the fire, telling stories and hoping your stored food would last until the thaw. It was a harsh, unforgiving loop, but it was a known one. We knew our place in it, until the fear came, and then nobody knew anything. This world, in all its muddy, superstitious and predictable glory, is slipping away, replaced by the crackle of flame and the stench of paranoia. If this glimpse into a simpler, less fiery past speaks to a wisdom you wish to preserve, then honor the old ways. Defy the coming silence. Subscribe to this channel, and let the echoes of our history be heard. Strike the bell icon as if it were the village warning of a coming storm, and ensure our stories do not turn to smoke and disappear forever. It begins not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper, a soughing, the slow, creeping curdling of a world we thought we understood. The predictable misery of our existence had a certain rhythm, a brutal but honest cadence. But then, the rhythm broke. It started, as great tragedies often do, with something laughably small. It started with a cow, a single unremarkable bovine belonging to a woman whose own disposition was famously sour. The milk, once sweet and creamy, began to come out thin, then lumpy, then altogether foul. A simple case of a sick animal, you might think, a matter of bad fodder or a flux in the gut. But common sense is the first casualty when fear begins to load its musket. You see, a sick cow is a random act of a merciless God, an inconvenience. But a cursed cow, a cow bewitched by a malevolent will, that is an act of war. It is a story, a drama, a puzzle to be solved. And the villagers of Oakhaven, starved for any entertainment that didn't involve watching a turnip rot, much preferred a good story. So, the whispers began. Who had looked upon the cow with envy? Who had muttered strange words while passing the paddock? The search was on, not for a veterinarian, but for a villain. It was so much more satisfying. The first whispers were tentative, shy things, darting from mouth to ear in the market, over a shared well, or in the sanctimonious gloom of the churchyard. They spoke of shadows moving at the edge of the pasture, of a strange sigil found traced in the dirt, a mark that looked suspiciously like a child's doodle of a bird. But in the fertile soil of ignorance, even the most absurd seeds can sprout into mighty oaks of conviction. The village needed a narrative, a grand explanation for why Martha's cow was producing cheese instead of milk, and mundane reality simply wasn't cutting it. Conveniently, the whispers soon found a name to cling to, like iron filings to a lodestone. Elara, the woman on the edge of the woods, the woman who understood the secrets of root and leaf, the woman who had just last week offered Martha a poultice for her gout. Could it be a coincidence? Of course not. Coincidence is the boring excuse of the unimaginative. Clearly, the poultice was a mere distraction, a feint to mask the true nefarious purpose, the deliberate and malicious curdling of dairy products. The logic was as watertight as a wicker basket. Then came the blight, a creeping blackness that began at the edges of the rye field, withering the stalks and turning the precious grain to dust. This was a more serious affair than a single cow's indigestion. This threatened the one thing we all shared, the gnawing, perpetual fear of starvation. A failed harvest meant a winter of weak, watery soups and hollow-eyed children. The stakes were raised, and so was the volume of the whispers. This was no petty curse. This was an assault on the entire village, an attack on God's own bounty. Who's to blame? Not the endless rain that had turned the soil to soup for a fortnight, not the strange mottled fungus that clung to the stalks, something our fathers and their fathers had seen before. No, that was nature, and nature was God's domain. To blame the rain would be to question the Almighty's plan, a deeply uncomfortable, if not heretical, thought. It was far, far easier to blame the woman who was seen walking near that very field, gathering herbs under the grim light of a new convenient that. Her presence there, once seen as a sign of her diligence, was now reframed as evidence of her wickedness. What was she gathering in the dark? Not chamomile for a soothing tea, surely. She must have been coaxing demons from the soil, whispering incantations to the unholy worms that gnawed upon the roots, poisoning the very earth with her foul intentions. Every villager became an expert in agricultural demonology overnight. They could practically taste the sulfur on the wind, a smell that was, in all likelihood, emanating from the village tanner. Personal grudges began to bubble to the surface, disguised as pious concern. Old man Hemlock, who still owed Elara for the salve that had saved his gangrenous leg 2 winters ago, was suddenly the most vocal. He recalled with newfound clarity a baleful glare she had given his prize-winning pig. The weaver, whose daughter Elara had failed to cure of the bloody flux, now saw malice in that failure. Not the simple limits of herbal medicine. The supernatural was a marvelous tool for settling old scores and erasing debts. Then the storm hit. It was a tempest of biblical proportions. A furious, black-hearted squall that clawed its way over the hills without warning. Hailstones the size of pigeon eggs hammered down, shredding the barley and turning the vegetable patches into a muddy ruin. It was a terrifying display of nature's indiscriminate power. Or was it? Indiscriminate power is a frightening concept. It suggests a world without reason, without justice, a world where you are nothing but a fragile thing at the mercy of chaotic forces. The directed, targeted storm, however, is a different matter entirely. A storm summoned from the heavens by a human hand? By a pact with the devil himself? Now that makes sense. It gives the terror a face. It gives the chaos a name. And as the villagers huddled in their huts, listening to the roar of the wind, that name was spoken again and again, no longer in a whisper, but in a hiss. Elara. Who else could command the very sky to wage war upon them? It was the only explanation that offered the cold comfort of a tangible enemy. Fear is a potent intoxicant. It sharpens the senses to threats that do not exist, and dulls them to the simple truths sitting right before your eyes. It creates its own logic, its own set of irrefutable proofs. Did Elara have a black cat? A sign of a familiar. Did she live alone? A sign of her rejection of godly community. Did she sometimes mutter to herself while working? Clearly, she was conversing with imps. Every aspect of her quiet, solitary life was meticulously re-examined, twisted, and re-catalogued as evidence for the prosecution. The village priest, a man whose imagination was far more vivid than his theology was sound, did little to quell the rising tide. In fact, he swam with it. His Sunday sermons, once dreary recitations on the importance of tithing, became thrilling tales of demonic infiltration. He spoke of the devil walking among them, wearing a human guise, seeking to turn the faithful from God's light. He never mentioned Elara by name, of course. He didn't have to. Every eye in that chapel knew exactly whose soul was so thoroughly damned. Soon the sickness came. A young boy, Thomas, was struck down with a fever that burned like a furnace. He thrashed and cried out in a delirium, his words a nonsensical jumble. Elara was cold as she always was. She sat by his bedside for 2 days and 2 nights, applying cool cloths and forcing sips of a willow bark decoction between his cracked lips. But the fever held. The boy's mother, wild with grief and terror, looked at the healer, not with hope, but with a new, dawning horror. This wasn't a healer trying to save her son. This was the very architect of his suffering. The logic was perverse but powerful. Elara wasn't failing to cure him. She was actively tormenting him, drawing out his life force for some unspeakable ritual. The proof? The boy, in his fevered state, had cried out the word cat. And what did Elara own? A black cat. It was a confession, wrung from the poor child's lips by the very witch who was destroying him. The fact that the family's own barn was infested with cats was an irrelevant detail, an inconvenient fact to be discarded on the pyre of rising hysteria. This is how the sane world ends. Not with a bang, but with a series of perfectly logical, utterly insane connections. A sour cow, a failed crop, a summer storm, and a sick child. 4 separate misfortunes, 4 random acts of nature and chance, were now braided together into a single strong rope, a rope that was being fashioned into a noose, a rope that was being woven to fit perfectly around the neck of the one person who had tried to help. The change in the village was palpable. Where once Elara received respectful nods, she now faced a wall of silence, of gazes that slid away from hers. The mothers who had once brought their children to her for cures now clutched them close as she passed, making signs against the evil eye. The men who had sought her wisdom on planting times now spat in the dirt where she walked. The transformation was complete. The healer had become the disease. Her knowledge, once a treasured resource, was now seen as a forbidden arsenal. Every dried herb hanging from her rafters was a potential poison. Every chant she used to focus her mind while preparing a remedy was a demonic pact. Her skill was no longer a gift, it was a crime. Her wisdom was no longer a comfort, it was a threat. She had not changed at all, but the eyes looking upon her had, and that was all that mattered. The fear needed an outlet, a sacrifice. It was a hunger that grew with every misfortune, a beast that demanded to be fed. Blaming the weather is unsatisfying. Blaming God is unthinkable. Blaming yourselves, your own poor farming techniques or unsanitary conditions is impossible. The human mind, in its desperate search for order, will always choose the simplest, most cathartic explanation. It will always choose the witch. It is a terrifyingly simple formula. Take 1 part communal misfortune, add 2 parts pre-existing superstition, and mix thoroughly with a general ignorance of the natural world. Sprinkle liberally with personal grudges and sanctimonious religion. Let the mixture fester in a climate of fear. The result is always the same: a scapegoat, a convenient vessel into which an entire community can pour its terror, its frustration, and its rage. And so, the stage was set. The whispers had done their work. They had built a case in the court of public opinion, a case without evidence, without reason, but with the undeniable heavy-weight conviction of shared panic. All that was needed now was for one person, one brave or foolish or malicious soul, to step forward and turn the whisper into a formal, public accusation. The kindling was laid, the wood was dry, all it needed was a single spark. The first stone had been cast, not by a hand, but by 1,000 venomous whispers. The seeds of accusation, planted in the fertile ground of fear, had taken root. They were growing into a thorny briar patch from which there would be no escape, strangling the life out of reason, compassion, and truth. The air grew thick with unspoken certainty, and the shadow of the gallows began to stretch long over our small, terrified village. This pattern of blame, this desperate search for a simple answer to complex problems, echoes through the ages. It is a human failing we have yet to cure. The names and the accusations change, but the underlying fear remains the same. The need to point a finger, to find a witch, is a darkness that lurks within us all. It is a story that must be told, must be remembered, lest we repeat it. Don't let these desperate cries for logic and reason fade into the static of history. Don't allow the whispers of the past to be silenced. To bear witness to these tales of unfounded accusation and the terrifying power of collective fear, subscribe to this channel now, activate the notification bell, and join our congregation of remembrance. We must keep these fires burning, not to consume the innocent, but to illuminate the darkness of our own making, ensuring it never descends again. Just when we thought our local homespun brand of superstitious terror was the peak of unpleasantness, the professionals arrived. They didn't shuffle into Oakhaven covered in the familiar mud and grime of the common man. They rode in on horses that seemed dismissive of our very existence, their black robes absorbing the light, their faces etched with the grim satisfaction of men who are absolutely certain they are doing God's work. Our chaotic, amateurish panic was about to get a masterclass in organized persecution. The experts were here. With them, they brought a chilling new atmosphere of legitimacy. The vague, gossipy fears that had condemned Elara in the court of public opinion were now to be formalized, notarized, and filed in triplicate. These were not mere villagers driven by grudges and a fear of sour milk. These were inquisitors, judges, men of letters, and, more importantly, men of authority. They came armed not with pitchforks, but with papers, pens, and a sanctimonious fury that made our local anxieties look like a charming fireside story. And they brought their book. Oh, the book! It was called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It was thick, bound in dark leather, and it landed on the tavern table with a thud that silenced all conversation. This was not just a book, it was a manual, a wholly approved, step-by-step guide to identifying, prosecuting, and ultimately destroying witches. It was a bestseller, the must-have home accessory for any aspiring persecutor, written by a man who seemed to have a terrifyingly vivid imagination and a serious problem with women. The Hammer of Witches was a masterpiece of circular logic. It answered every question and closed every loophole, creating a perfect, inescapable trap. For instance, if the accused confessed under torture, she was guilty. If she did not confess, her silence was proof that the devil was giving her supernatural strength to resist, which meant she was definitely guilty. If she was faint and terrified, it was the sign of a guilty conscience. If she remained calm and defiant, it was the mark of a hardened, unrepentant sinner. There were no right answers. The game was rigged from the very first page. Suddenly, our simple familiar superstitions were elevated to the level of legal doctrine. The local priest, who had fanned the flames with his vague sermons, now found himself utterly outclassed. He was a country fiddler in the presence of a grand orchestra of institutionalized paranoia. The inquisitors spoke with the cold certainty of bureaucrats and the fiery zeal of fanatics, a truly terrifying combination. They were here to cleanse us, to bring order to our chaos, and our village was to be the stage for their grand, grotesque theater of justice. The process began with a formal invitation for accusations. Anyone with a grievance, a suspicion, or a simple dislike for a neighbor was encouraged to come forward. All testimony was welcome, especially the sort that couldn't possibly be verified. Did your neighbor's goat stare at you menacingly? That's evidence. Did a woman you argued with last week appear in your dream as a crow? Damning testimony. The inquisitors nodded gravely, their scribes' quills scratching away, turning petty squabbles and paranoid fantasies into official, actionable fact. Then came the experts themselves, looking very important as they laid out their tools. They knew exactly what to look for thanks to their infallible handbook. The devil, you see, was a meticulous record-keeper. Upon making a pact, he would seal the deal by leaving his mark upon the witch's body, a physical sign of their allegiance. And these men, these holy detectives, were uniquely qualified to find it. The hunt for this mark became the central pillar of the investigation, a grim and humiliating spectacle. The search was a violation disguised as a procedure. The accused, most often a woman like Elara, would be stripped bare in front of a panel of stern, pious men. Every inch of her body was subject to scrutiny. They were searching for the witch's teat or the devil's mark. This could be anything: a mole, a wart, a birthmark, a scar from a childhood fall, even an unusual freckle. Any small imperfection of the human body was recontextualized as a diabolical seal. Turns out, being human was often enough evidence. To confirm the mark's demonic nature, a long pin would be used. The inquisitor would probe the suspected area. If the accused did not bleed, or more importantly, if she did not feel pain, it was considered an infallible sign of the devil's touch. Of course, a skilled prober could easily trick the eye, or the victim could simply be too paralyzed by fear and shame to react as expected. Sometimes the pins themselves were retractable, a neat little party trick to guarantee the desired result. Justice, after all, must be served. Elara, the woman who had mended our broken bones and soothed our fevers, was subjected to this very procedure. Her hands, which knew the language of healing herbs, were bound. Her body, which she had held with a quiet dignity, became a map for them to explore, searching for a sign of damnation. A small, pale scar on her shoulder, a relic from a clumsy girlhood encounter with a rose bush, became the focus of intense scholarly debate. Was this the spot? Was this the very place the Dark Lord had claimed her for his own? The village watched this new phase with a kind of horrified fascination. The raw, emotional hysteria of the initial accusations was replaced by the cold, grinding machinery of a legal process. There were hearings, depositions, and exhibits. It all looked so official, so proper. It gave the persecution a veneer of respectability. This wasn't a mob anymore. It was a tribunal. The pitchforks had been replaced by paperwork, which somehow made it all the more terrifying. The inquisitors had an answer for everything. They explained with condescending patience that witches could curdle milk from a mile away, summon hailstorms by stirring a bucket of water, and cause impotence with a mere glance. They could make themselves invisible, transform into animals, and fly to their sabbats on enchanted broomsticks. The Malleus Maleficarum said so. And who were we, simple, uneducated folk, to argue with a printed book? Elara's knowledge of herbal remedies, once the primary source of suspicion, was now presented as Exhibit A. Her carefully dried bundles of willow bark, chamomile, and comfrey were laid out as if they were poisons and demonic potions. The inquisitors would hold up a sprig of rosemary and declare it an ingredient for a flying ointment. They would point to a jar of dried lavender and claim it was used to summon incubi. Her entire apothecary, a library of healing, was rewritten as an arsenal of black magic. The trial was a farce, a performance for which the conclusion had already been written. Elara's denials were dismissed as lies. Her attempts at reason were twisted into cunning deceptions. When she was asked to recite the Lord's Prayer and stumbled over a single word out of sheer terror, the room erupted in gasps. The book was clear on this, too. A witch is incapable of uttering the holy words perfectly. It was another check mark in another box on the form that condemned her. The bureaucracy of it all was the most chilling part. There were clerks and scribes, official documents and wax seals. Every accusation was recorded. Every session of questioning was minuted. This wasn't just murder. It was state-sanctioned, legally codified, meticulously documented murder. The process created a buffer of responsibility. The accuser was just a concerned citizen. The scribe was just recording words. The judge was just following the law. No single person had to feel the full weight of the kill. The fear in the village changed its character. It was no longer a hot, reactive panic. It became a cold, creeping dread. Before, you feared a curse on your crops. Now you feared the knock on the door. You feared the neighbor who owed you money, the cousin who coveted your land, the friend you had a drunken argument with last harvest. Any word could be an accuser. Any word, any action, could be reported, recorded, and misinterpreted by the men in black. The inquisitors held the power of life and death, and they wielded it with an unnerving mixture of pious gravity and bureaucratic detachment. They were convinced they were surgeons of the soul, cutting out a cancer from the heart of the community. But they were the disease, spreading a plague of suspicion and terror that turned neighbor against neighbor and tore the very fabric of our world apart. They found a village squabbling over a sick cow and gave them a full-blown holy war. The logic of the hammer was inescapable. It asserted that to deny the existence of witches was itself the greatest heresy. To question the process was to side with the devil. This brilliant, diabolical maneuver silenced all potential critics. To speak up for the accused, to offer a defense, or to simply point out the utter lack of credible evidence was to paint a target on your own back. Silence became the only safe harbor in a sea of madness. And so Elara stood alone. The people she had healed now stood as witnesses against her. The children she had saved from fevers now pointed and called her a monster. The community she had served was now complicit in her destruction, too terrified to intervene. They had outsourced their conscience to the experts, the men with the book, who assured them this was all necessary, righteous, and good. The inquisitors turned our world into a courtroom where the defendant was presumed guilty, the evidence was spectral, and the only possible verdict was death. They took our simple, ignorant fears and gave them a complex, terrifying legal framework. They convinced us that the greatest evil was not famine or plague, but the old woman who lived on the edge of the woods and knew too much about herbs. This transformation of paranoid gossip into a state policy bureaucratic horror show is a chilling chapter in human history. The meticulous, procedural nature of the evil makes it all the more grotesque. It's a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those who break the rules, but those who write them, the ones who create a system where inhumanity becomes policy. If you are still trying to process the sheer, mind-numbing horror of a witch being condemned by a committee, of a life being extinguished by a flowchart of damnation, then you understand the abyss we are staring into. Don't let the details of this bureaucratic nightmare be forgotten. Subscribe to this broadcast, hit the notification bell with the force of a righteous hammer, and ensure these stories of institutionalized madness are never ever erased from the ledger. The search for a witch's mark having yielded the entirely predictable result of finding skin on a human, the inquisitors moved to the next more vigorous phase of their investigation. The body had been searched for evidence, now the soul would be plumbed. It was time to obtain a confession. After all, a conviction feels so much more satisfying when the accused agrees with your verdict, even if you have to dislocate their every joint to secure that agreement. This stage of the process was not called torture, of course. That would be uncivilized. It was referred to simply as the question. They have persuasive arguments. An entire theology was built around the idea that since the devil lent his witches supernatural endurance, one could not expect to get the truth through polite conversation. Extraordinary wickedness required extraordinary methods of inquiry. The process was meant to purify the soul, to break the devil's hold, so the truth could emerge. It was a holy act, you see, an act of liberation. It just happened to look, sound, and feel exactly like brutal, systematic agony. The Lord works in mysterious and apparently very painful ways. The entire affair began with a tour, a moment of grim hospitality. The accused, in this case Elara, was brought to a dark, windowless room that smelled of sweat, fear, and damp stone. Here, the torturer, a man with the physique of a blacksmith and the gentle eyes of a shark, would introduce his tools. He would hold up the thumbscrews, explaining their simple, elegant mechanics. He would point to the heavy ropes of the strappado, lovingly coiled like sleeping serpents. This was the first degree of questioning, a friendly, non-verbal invitation to confess before things got unpleasant. When this silent persuasion failed, as it did with Elara, the question began in earnest. They started with the small things, the appetizers on the grand banquet of pain. The thumbscrews were a favorite for their portability and efficiency. A simple vice, slowly tightened, crushing finger, toe, or thumb. The goal was to produce a sharp, undeniable agony that focused the mind wonderfully. It's amazing how a few turns of a screw can make you reconsider your entire life, especially your stubborn insistence that you have never, in fact, danced naked in a graveyard. But physical pain was only one tool in their well-stocked kit. Psychological torment was a finer art. The most cruelly effective method was simple sleep deprivation. For 3 days and 3 nights, Elara was kept awake. She was forced to stand or walk, prodded with pikes whenever her eyes began to close. The world dissolved into a smear of wavering torchlight and hollow-eyed faces. Time lost all meaning. The questions became a droning, endless litany, blending with the buzzing in her skull. In this waking nightmare, the walls of reality began to crumble. Her own thoughts became alien. The Inquisitor's suggestions, their lurid tales of sabbats and demonic pacts, began to seep into the cracks of her exhausted mind. Did she consort with an imp named Guzzle? At this point, she wasn't entirely sure she hadn't. Did she fly to the blasphemous gathering on a goat? The memory felt as real as the stone floor beneath her feet. She would have confessed to personally inventing the common cold if it meant she could just close her eyes for a minute. When her resolve still flickered, they introduced her to the strappado. Her hands were bound behind her back, a rope was slung over a pulley in the ceiling, and she was hoisted into the air. The initial pull was agonizing, her arms wrenched into an unnatural position. But the true artistry of the strappado was in the drop. They would let the rope go slack, allowing her to fall several feet before it snapped taut again. The force would tear her shoulders from their sockets with a wet, popping sound that echoed in the silent room. Then, hanging by her ruined arms, the questions would resume. Throughout this ordeal, the bureaucratic wheels never stopped turning. A scribe sat in the corner, his quill scratching away, dutifully recording the testimony. He was a master of creative transcription. Elara's incoherent screams were translated into articulate confessions. Her desperate, pain-fueled ramblings about goats and moonlight were polished into a legally sound narrative of witchcraft. He was not a liar, merely an editor, ensuring the evidence was tidy enough for the court record. Justice abhors a messy transcript. They brought out the rack. It was the centerpiece of their collection, the ultimate argument winner. It was a simple wooden frame, elegant in its brutality. Her ankles were shackled to one end, her wrists to the other. A large lever controlled a ratchet mechanism. With each crank of the lever, the rollers would turn, stretching her body. The first few clicks produced a chorus of creaking joints. Then came the sharp reports of tearing ligaments, the dull pop of cartilage giving way. Her bones were screaming. And under this duress, the truth finally poured out. It was a torrent of whatever they wanted to hear. Yes, she had blighted the crops. Yes, she had soured the milk. Yes, she had summoned the hailstorm that flattened the barley. She confessed to it all, her voice a raw, broken whisper. They asked for names, and she gave them, not out of malice, but because they would not stop cranking the lever until she did. She named the old woman who had died last winter, and the midwife who had moved away years ago. The dead and the distant made the safest accomplices. She confessed to riding a goat to the moon. It sounded plausible at the time, more plausible, certainly, than the idea that these pious, God-fearing men were capable of such calculated cruelty. In the upside-down world of the torture chamber, a flying goat was a perfectly logical explanation. It was a story. And a story was what they wanted. Her own simple truth, that she was just a woman who knew her herbs, was of no interest to anyone. It lacked dramatic flair. They wanted to know about the Sabbat. So, borrowing from their own lurid questions, she described it. She told them of the obscene feasts, the blasphemous rites, the dancing, the kissing of the devil's posterior, a detail they seemed particularly keen on. She painted a picture so vivid, so detailed, that she almost believed it herself. She gave them a masterpiece of demonic fiction, co-authored by their questions and her own agony. The doctor was often present during these sessions, not to offer comfort, but to act as a consultant. He would check the victim's pulse, examine their eyes, and advise the torturer on how much more the body could endure before it broke completely or, inconveniently, died. It was crucial that the victim survive long enough to repeat the confession in court, freely and without coercion. The definition of freely was, it appears, quite flexible. The entire system was a grotesque parody of justice. It was not designed to discover truth, but to produce it. The confession was the entire point of the exercise. The trial that followed was a mere formality, a piece of theatre to ratify a conclusion that had been reached long ago in a dark room full of iron and screams. The testimony was not the victim's, it was an echo of the torturer's own fevered imagination, spoken back to him through a mouthpiece of broken humanity. They would use fire, applying hot irons to the soles of the feet. They would use water, forcing gallons of it down the victim's throat in a hideous mock baptism. They had the witch's bridle, an iron muzzle with a sharpened plate that was forced into the mouth, silencing screams and shredding the tongue. They called these things aids to piety, designed to encourage a sinner's repentance. The devil, it seems, has a fantastic talent for euphemism. For Elara, the end of the questioning came when there was simply nothing left of her to break. Her body was a ruin, her mind a shattered vessel. She signed the transcribed confession with a hand that no longer felt like her own. She had done what was required. She had given them their story, their proof, their victory. She had traded her soul not to the devil, but to a committee of holy men who needed a villain for their morality plan. And the village? They heard the confession read aloud in the public square. They gasped in all the right places. They shook their heads at the depravity of it all. They were horrified and perhaps a little thrilled. The words confirmed their deepest fears and justified the entire process. They did not hear the screams behind the elegant calligraphy. They did not see the dislocated shoulders or the crushed fingers. They only saw the proof, clean, clear, and undeniable. The inquisitors were satisfied. Their methods, guided by God and the Malleus Maleficarum, had worked perfectly. They had taken a stubborn, silent woman and, through a careful application of theological principles and mechanical leverage, had revealed the truth hidden in her soul. They had saved her from the devil's grasp, and in doing so had saved the entire village. They slept the sleep of the righteous, untroubled by the echoes from the room below. This is the grim reality of how evidence was created. It was not found, but forged. It was manufactured in a crucible of pain, crafted from delirium and despair. To call it testimony is to insult the very concept of truth. It was a script, written by the accusers and performed by the accused, with agony as the director. Justice was not just blind, she was deaf, mute, and holding a thumbscrew. The depths of this depravity are hard to fathom. The sheer, systematic cruelty performed in the name of purity is a lesson that should burn in our collective memory. They created a system where the only way to prove your innocence was to have a body that could not be broken and a mind that could not be shattered. A test no human could ever pass. We observe these painful histories because we must. We must listen to the silent screams embedded in the official records and understand that truth is often just a confession extracted under duress. If you believe these agonizing truths must be heard, support our very painful observations. Hit that subscribe button before they decide to waterboard your receiver for its heretical silence. Click the bell and let it ring like a bone-snapping crank of the rack, a sound that wards the future of the past. After the soul-plumbing ordeal of the question, which produced a confession as reliable as a drunken man's directions, the inquisitors required something more. They needed physical proof. A confession extracted through agony was excellent for the court records, but to truly sell the verdict to the masses, they needed something tangible, something they could point to. They needed the devil's signature, his official seal of ownership imprinted on the flesh of the accused. Thus began the clinical, grotesque, and utterly absurd hunt for the witch's mark. According to the leading theological minds and diabolical dermatologists of the day, when a witch made her pact with Satan, he would seal the deal by leaving his mark upon her. This was not merely a symbolic gesture, it was a physical alteration of the flesh. The mark, they claimed with unnerving confidence, had two defining characteristics. It was insensible to pain, and when pricked, it would not bleed. It was a neat and tidy theory, a perfect piece of evidence that could be, with a little effort, found on absolutely anyone. Entered the witch pricker, a new and profitable profession for the enterprising and morally flexible. These men, often with no medical training whatsoever, became traveling experts in diabolical forensics. For a handsome fee, they would come to your town and identify the guilty with their specialized tools and even more specialized lack of scruples. They were the respected consultants in a homicidal cottage industry, their authority resting solely on their willingness to poke and prod a terrified naked person in front of a committee of grim-faced officials. The examination was a ritual of humiliation, designed to strip away the humanity of the accused long before the sentence did. Elara, like so many others, was brought into a room and ordered to remove her clothing. The air was cold, but not as cold as the clinical, searching eyes of the men who now held absolute power over her body. Her neighbors, the people she had known her whole life, were now her judges, her jury, and a silent, gawking audience to her degradation. This was the first step, transforming a person into a specimen. The visual inspection began. The searcher would walk slowly around the accused, his gaze sharp, his expression a mask of pious concentration. He was looking for any anomaly, any imperfection. The mark of the devil, as it turns out, looks remarkably like a freckle, or a wart, or a mole, or that old pale scar from falling out of a tree as a child. Very specific, Satan is, and very, very fond of benign skin conditions. Every common blemish became a point of profound suspicion, noted by the scribe with a grave nod. A particularly sought-after sign was the so-called witch's teat. The experts theorized that every witch possessed a supernumerary nipple, a third teat, which she used to suckle her demonic familiars, imps, cats, toads, or any other creature that looked vaguely suspicious. Any skin tag, raised mole, or strange fold of skin could be interpreted as this diabolical appendage. The anatomical creativity of the inquisitors was truly something to behold. They could find a demonic nipple almost anywhere, if they looked hard enough. When a promising blemish was located, the witch pricker would produce the tool of his trade, the bodkin. It was a long, sharp needle, sometimes several inches in length, set in a wooden handle. He would hold it up to the light, allowing its sharp point to glint for all to see. This was an instrument of truth, a scientific device for revealing hidden evil. The fact that it was also an instrument of pain and terror was merely a convenient side effect of its holy purpose. Then came the pricking. The searcher, with the steady hand of a seasoned craftsman, would take aim at the suspected mark on Elara's skin and thrust the needle in. All eyes were on her face, watching for the slightest reaction. It was an impossible test. If she cried out or flinched, the mark was deemed ordinary, but she was noted as being uncooperative. If, however, she remained still, either from shock, terror, or sheer will, it was taken as proof. See? She felt no pain. The devil's anesthesia at work. The second part of the test was the blood. After withdrawing the needle, the pricker would examine the tiny wound. If it failed to bleed, or bled very little, this was considered infallible proof of the mark's demonic nature. The devil's touch, you see, supposedly cauterized the flesh. Of course, a shallow prick might not draw much blood, and the body's own response to shock could momentarily restrict blood flow. These were natural explanations and therefore entirely uninteresting to the men in charge. The real genius of the witch pricker's trade, however, was in the trickery. Many of these men carried bodkins with retractable points. With a bit of sleight of hand, the needle would slide back into the handle, appearing to enter the flesh without actually breaking the skin. The lack of pain and blood was therefore guaranteed. It was a marvel of engineering, a perfect tool for manufacturing guilt while maintaining a veneer of procedural fairness. It was a lie made of steel and wood. If an initial search of the body proved fruitless, the process escalated. The next step was a full-body shaving. The accused would be shorn of all hair, from their head, their arms, their legs, their most private regions. The official justification was that the devil was cunning and might hide his mark beneath a patch of hair. The actual, far more effective purpose was to complete the process of dehumanization. To be shorn like an animal was to be seen as one. Even after all this, if no satisfactory mark could be found, the witch-finders had one final, brilliant trick up their robes. They could simply declare that the witch possessed an invisible mark. The devil, in his infinite cunning, had made his seal unseen to mortal eyes. This did not, however, make it immune to the pricker's needle. The searcher would then proceed to poke the victim's entire body, repeatedly, until he inevitably found a spot that, through sheer chance or numbness, yielded the desired reaction. This entire process was a masterclass in confirmation bias. The Inquisitions and their prickers were not searching for evidence of guilt or innocence. They were searching for confirmation of a guilt they had already decided upon. Every action, every reaction, every inch of the accused's body was interpreted through a lens of absolute certainty. The human body, with its lifetime of small scars, marks, and imperfections, was turned into a living document of damnation. For Elara, the discovery was made on her left thigh, a small brown mole she'd had since birth. The pricker announced it with triumphant gravity. The bodkin was prepared. She braced herself, her mind a maelstrom of terror and defiance. The needle plunged in. She bit her lip so hard she tasted her own blood, her every muscle screaming, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a cry. She remained rigid, a statue of silent fury. "She does not feel it," the pricker declared to the room. He withdrew the needle. A tiny bead of blood welled up, but he wiped it away with a deft movement of his thumb before the judges could see. "And it does not bleed. The mark is found." A murmur of awe and horror filled the room. The scribe's quill flew across the page. It was done. Irrefutable, physical proof. A mole she had once called her lucky spot had just become her death warrant. The absurdity is almost comical, were it not so deadly. The entire system of justice rested on the scientific interpretation of common skin blemishes. A person's life could be forfeit because of a wart. A community could be torn apart over a birthmark. The full authority of the church and the state was brought to bear in a process that had all the intellectual rigor of children pointing at clouds and arguing about what shapes they see. They created a perfect, closed loop of logic. The mark proves the pact with the devil. The pact proves the woman is a witch. The witch by her nature will lie and deny her guilt. Therefore, any attempt to explain that the mark is just a mole is simply further proof of her cunning and wickedness. There was no way out. The diagnostic manual was written by the executioner. Imagine the terror, not just of the pain, but of your own body betraying you, the skin you have lived in your entire life, the map of your own small history suddenly reinterpreted as a monstrous text. The scar from when you fell learning to walk, the freckles sprinkled across your nose by the summer sun, the mole on your neck your mother used to kiss, all of it twisted into evidence of the most profound evil imaginable. This focus on the physical was a way of making the fantastical seem real. It grounded the ethereal concept of a demonic pact in the solid reality of flesh and blood. It allowed people to look at a woman like Elara and see not a person but a thing that was marked, a tainted object that needed to be disposed of for the good of the community. It made condemnation easy. The witch prickers, these ghoulish entrepreneurs, often became wealthy men. They would move on to the next town, their pouches heavy with silver, leaving behind a community shattered by suspicion and a pyre waiting to be lit. They were parasites feeding on fear, their authority derived from a needle, and their expertise a lie. And yet they were revered as saviors, as holy warriors in the fight against darkness. The search for the mark was a hunt where the quarry was guaranteed to be found, because the quarry was not a witch. The quarry was human imperfection. It was the simple, unavoidable fact that living leaves marks. To be alive is to be flawed, scarred, and blemished. In the burning times, this simple fact was enough to get you killed. The perfect body was a myth, and an imperfect body was a crime scene. This was not a search for truth. It was a ceremony of condemnation. It was a brutal, invasive ritual designed to ratify a pre-existing verdict. The evidence wasn't discovered on the body of the accused, it was projected onto it by the accusers. The witch's mark was, in the end, nothing more than a reflection of the darkness in the eyes of the men who claimed to be searching for it. The history of medicine is filled with strange and horrifying diagnostic methods, but surely this ranks among the most perverse. A system of forensics based on finding the devil in the details of a person's skin. A medical examination where the only possible diagnosis is a terminal one. It's a chapter of our past that is as perplexing as it is horrifying. To continue to make sense of these perplexing new diagnostic methods and the chilling logic that drove them, you must stay with this broadcast. Do not allow the signal to fade. Help us exhume these terrifying truths from the footnotes of history by subscribing now. Press the notification bell as if you were testing a witch's mark, and ensure these stories of institutionalized madness are felt for generations to come. After the intimate horrors of the questioning room and the clinical violations of the search, it was time for some theater. A public trial. This was the grand finale of the investigative process, the moment where the private, grubby work of extracting a confession and finding a mark was presented to the world as righteous, unimpeachable justice. The town square, usually a place of commerce and gossip, was transformed into a grand stage, and the entire population of Oakhaven had turned out for the premiere. Justice, after all, should not only be done, but be seen to be done, especially when it involves a satisfying execution. I was led to a wooden platform erected in the center of the square, the jeers and prayers of the crowd washing over me like a filthy tide. The sun was bright, a cruel irony against the darkness of the occasion. My body was a ruin, a testament to the Inquisitor's vigorous search for truth, and my appearance alone seemed to be half the evidence against me. The good people of the village saw my broken state not as the result of their piety, but as a physical manifestation of my soul's corruption. It's amazing how a dislocated shoulder can look so much like damnation. The trial, it was less a search for truth and more a performance piece. The verdict was written before I even entered the room, or in this case, the square. My only real task was to look sufficiently terrified and guilty. I'm good at that now. They even gave me a front row seat. The judges sat at a long table on the platform, looking impossibly stern and important. They were the directors of this play, their faces set in grim masks of civic duty, as if they were grappling with a complex legal question, and not simply rubber-stamping a foregone conclusion. There was no one beside me, no advocate, no counsel, no one to speak on my behalf. The very concept of a legal defense was a foreign one in this court. In the impeccable logic of the witchfinder, anyone who would dare to defend a witch must therefore be in league with her. It was a brilliant system for ensuring a smooth and efficient trial, unencumbered by inconvenient things like opposing arguments or exculpatory evidence. My innocence was not a possibility to be explored. My guilt was a premise to be publicly confirmed. The proceedings began. The lead judge, a man with a magnificent beard and a voice accustomed to booming, read the charges. It was a long and creative list, a greatest hits of my secretly wicked life. It began with the souring of Martha's milk and escalated dramatically from there, including blighting crops, summoning storms, consorting with demons, and, the crowd favorite, engaging in aerial goat-based travel. The list was so long and fantastical I almost felt a flicker of pride. For a reclusive herbalist, I had apparently been exceptionally busy. Then came the witnesses. One by one, my neighbors were called up to give their testimony. Old man Hemlock, his leg now fully healed thanks to a salve I'd made him, spoke of the baleful glare I'd given his pig. The weaver, whose daughter had tragically died of the flux, tearfully recounted how I had failed to save her, the implication being that my failure was not one of medicine, but of malicious intent. Petty grievances and personal tragedies were polished into damning evidence of witchcraft. Next, the scribe was called forward to read my confession. He read it in a clear, unwavering monotone, his voice giving a bizarre sense of legitimacy to the pain-induced fictions he recited. The crowd listened, rapt, as he detailed my supposed pact with the devil, my attendance at the Sabbat, and my list of accomplices. Hearing my delirious ramblings read back to me as a formal legal document was perhaps the most surreal moment of the entire ordeal. It was like listening to a madman's poem being reviewed as a work of serious history. The physical evidence was presented with a flourish. The witch pricker, looking smug and professional, was called to testify. He described in detail his discovery of the devil's mark on my thigh, a mole I had known my entire life. He brandished his needle for the crowd to see, the instrument of his infallible science. He spoke of my lack of reaction, my failure to bleed properly. It was the climax of his performance, and the crowd gasped on cue. The mole was no longer a mole, it was a demonic sigil, a brand of absolute guilt. Then they introduced their most powerful and ridiculous weapon, spectral evidence. A young woman was brought forward who swore under oath that while she was sleeping, my spectre, my spirit formed, had flown into her room and tormented her. She described me pinching her and whispering blasphemies in her ear. How could I defend myself against that? I could hardly provide a witness to attest to the whereabouts of my own soul while my body was asleep. It was the perfect, unanswerable accusation. Finally, it was my turn to speak. The judge turned to me, his expression one of magnanimous patience. "Elara," he boomed, "you have heard the testimony against you. What say you to these charges?" All eyes were on me. The square was silent, save for the cawing of a real crow, not a spectral one. What could I say? If I denied everything, I was a liar, brazen in my sin. If I repeated the confession, I was sealing my own fate. If I stayed silent, my silence would be taken as an admission of guilt. I chose silence. I simply looked at them, at the judges, at the crowd, at the faces of the people I had served. I let them see the ruin they had made of me. I let my silence be my final testimony, a testament to the utter futility of words in a world that had gone deaf to reason. My silence seemed to enrage the judge more than any denial. It was defiance. It was contempt for his sacred court. He saw it as the devil's own pride, and he slammed his fist on the table. The deliberation was a masterpiece of theatrical brevity. The judges leaned in towards each other, whispering amongst themselves for a full minute, their faces a caricature of deep, thoughtful consideration. They nodded slowly, as if weighing complex points of law. In reality, they were likely deciding where to go for lunch. The verdict had been in the bag for days. This was just for show, the dramatic pause before the final act. The lead judge stood, his great beard seeming to bristle with righteous authority. He held a scroll in his hand. He cleared his throat, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "This court," he began, his voice echoing across the square, "having heard the evidence and the testimony, finds the accused Elara of Oakhaven to be guilty of all charges. We find her to be a heretic, a consort of the devil, a witch." A collective gasp and then a roar of approval went up from the crowd. There was a sense of profound relief, the kind of release that comes after a great tension. They had their villain. Their misfortunes had a face. The world made sense again. The verdict wasn't a tragedy, it was a resolution, a happy ending to their story of fear and confusion. I was the monster at the end of the book. Then came the sentence. To be taken from this place to the place of execution, there to be bound to a stake and cleansed by fire, so that her immortal soul might be saved from eternal damnation and the community protected from her wickedness. The judge's voice never wavered. He was not sentencing a woman to a horrific, agonizing death. He was prescribing a cure, a painful but necessary surgery for the good of the body politic. The trial was over. Justice had been served. Or rather, a performance of justice had been successfully staged. It had all the necessary components: a villain, a panel of wise judges, a chorus of concerned citizens, and a satisfying, morally unambiguous conclusion. It was a triumph of stagecraft over substance, of procedure over truth. My guilt was the star of the show, and it had received a standing ovation. The entire system was designed not to find truth, but to affirm a pre-existing belief. The presumption of guilt was the foundation upon which the entire structure was built. The rules of evidence were designed to support this presumption, and any contradictory information was simply discarded as irrelevant or deceptive. It was a legal machine designed to produce one, and only one, result. The crowd was not evil. They were terrified. They were people living on the knife's edge of existence, and they needed answers. They needed a reason for their suffering. The trial gave them that. It gave them a simple, powerful narrative where good triumphed over evil. I was a necessary sacrifice on the altar of their certainty. My death would make them feel safe, at least for a little while. And the judges? They were not monsters. They were bureaucrats. They were men who believed in their system, in their books, in their own righteousness. They were following a protocol, a flowchart of damnation that had been handed down to them by authorities higher than themselves. They were just doing their jobs, and their job was to convict witches, and they were very, very good at their jobs. This spectacle in the town square was the ultimate expression of their power. It wasn't enough to condemn someone in private. The condemnation had to be a public lesson, a warning to any others who might dare to live outside the norms, to know too much, or to simply have an unlucky mole. It was social control through ritualized terror. My lack of a defense was not a flaw in the system, it was the system's most important feature. It ensured efficiency. It prevented any messy complications. It allowed the narrative to proceed smoothly from accusation to execution without any detours into the murky territory of actual facts. Justice is so much simpler when you remove all the opposing arguments. The truth was never on trial. It was not invited to the proceedings. It was locked away in the same dark cell as my body, bruised and battered and ignored. The trial was about confirming a story the village had decided to tell itself, a story that made them the heroes and me the monster. And, in the end, everyone got the ending they wanted. Everyone except me. The whole production was, in its own grotesque way, a work of art, a perfectly constructed, self-mulating system of injustice. It was a legal black hole from which no light, and certainly no truth, could escape. It was, from the perspective of a student of bureaucratic horror, a thing of terrible beauty. And if you're finding this delightfully rigged, this masterfully orchestrated performance of legal theatre to be as fascinating as it is horrifying, then you know what to do. Smash that subscribe button with the force of a judge gavel hitting the table on a guilty verdict. Activate the bell to ensure you don't miss a single part of this rigged trial. Join us and bear witness to a justice system where the only surprise would be an acquittal. The fire that consumed me did not cleanse Oakhaven. It acted as a beacon. My trial was not the end of the village's fever, it was merely the first violent sneeze of a plague. The Inquisitors had shown them a marvelous new tool. They had demonstrated that witchcraft was not only real, but that accusing someone of it yielded tangible results. They had given the villagers a loaded pistol, and now everyone was looking around, wondering who to aim it at first. The air, once thick with the smoke of my pyre, was now thick with a far more toxic thing. Opportunity. A strange, predatory silence fell over the village. The initial, cathartic release of my conviction curdled into a quiet, simmering paranoia. If I, the quiet herbalist, could be a secret bride of Satan, then who else? The woman who sings too loudly in church? The blacksmith who is suspiciously strong? The farmer whose crops seem just a little too green? Everyone was a suspect. Every neighbor was a potential monster hiding in plain sight. The community did not heal. It fractured, breaking along the hidden fault lines of old grudges, petty jealousies, and simmering greed. The first new accusation came not with the boom of a judge's gavel, but as a bitter argument over a wandering pig. Two farmers, whose lands bordered each other, had been feuding over the boundary for a generation. When one man's prize sow fell ill, the cause was suddenly obvious. It wasn't the swill he'd fed her or a common sickness. No, it was the malevolent will of his neighbor, who had clearly cursed the animal with a sour glance from across the disputed fence line. The accusation was made, and suddenly the property dispute had escalated into a holy war. Witchcraft became the ultimate tool for personal advancement. It was a marvelous, all-purpose solvent for life's little problems. Your neighbor, who borrowed your shovel last week, suddenly points a finger. She cursed my pigs. Very convenient, when you covet his land. An accusation, if it stuck, could lead to the forfeiture of property. Land, livestock, possessions, all could be absorbed by the state, which might then graciously reward the pious, eagle-eyed citizen who brought the evil to light. It was a get-rich-quick scheme for the morally bankrupt. And oh, the petty grievances that came crawling out of the woodwork dressed in the robes of righteous indignation. The baker, whose bread was consistently flatter than his neighbor's, found his answer, not in his weak yeast, but in a diabolical hex placed upon his ovens. The young man, spurned by the village beauty, now understood her rejection. Her heart wasn't taken by another, her soul was taken by the devil. Her beauty a mere glamour to hide her corrupt. It was so much more comforting than admitting your bread was terrible or your conversation was dull. Fear makes strange bedfellows and very eager accusers. There were those who were not motivated by greed, but by a genuine, pant-sweating terror. These were the true believers, the ones who had listened to the sermons and read the pamphlets and now saw the devil's hand in every misfortune. A sudden chill in the air was a demonic presence. A quart of milk turning was a sure sign of a hex. These people became the neighborhood watch from hell, their eyes constantly scanning for any deviation from the norm, any sign of wickedness. The very fabric of the community rotted from the inside out. The simple trust that allows a village to function completely evaporated. No one borrowed a cup of sugar for fear it was poisoned. No one asked a neighbor to watch their child for fear the child would be hexed or, worse, taught blasphemies. The friendly chatter over the garden fence fell silent, replaced by furtive, suspicious glances. Every home became a tiny, fortified island, and every neighbor a potential enemy. Oakhaven was no longer a village. It was a collection of strangers living in a state of undeclared war. Children, with their vivid imaginations and porous understanding of truth, became the newest and most terrifying weapon in this war. Their testimony was considered pure, as they were believed to be too innocent to lie. A child's nightmare about a shadowy figure in their room could be coached and polished into a formal accusation against the person that child's parents happened to despise. "Tell us, little one, did the shadow look like Goody Miller from down the lane?" The age of innocence was over. The age of the tiny, terrifying witness had begun. The original inquisitors had moved on, leaving a neatly written instruction manual on how to tear a community apart. They had empowered the local authorities, the petty magistrates and ambitious priests, who were now eager to continue the great work. They had tasted a new kind of power, the absolute power over life and death, and they found it intoxicating. The great gears of the witch-hunting machine, once started, could now churn on their own, grinding up anyone who got caught in them. A terrible logic took hold, the logic of preemptive accusation. It became clear that the safest position to be in was not that of the silent observer, but that of the accuser. If you pointed the finger first, it directed suspicion away from yourself. It was a demonstration of your own piety and vigilance. Accusing your neighbor became an act of self-preservation. It was a brutal zero-sum game, and the only winning move was to ensure someone else lost first. The social gatherings, once centered around harvests and holidays, were now centered around trials and executions. These became the new village festivals, the only form of communal entertainment. People would flock to the town square, their faces a grim mixture of fear and morbid excitement. They watched as their former friends and neighbors were condemned, and in the spectacle of their demise, they found a perverse sense of security. At least it wasn't them, not today. The definition of suspicious behavior expanded to include almost anything. To be too old was suspicious, to be too young and beautiful was suspicious, to be too wealthy was a sign of demonic aid, to be too poor was a sign of divine disfavor, to be reclusive and silent was proof of a secret, hidden life, to be outgoing and social was a sign of a deceptive, manipulative nature. The only way to be safe was to be utterly, perfectly average, and no one is that. The fear was a contagion that spread faster than any plague. It leapt from house to house, transmitted on whispers and sideways glances. Once a single member of a family was accused, the entire bloodline became suspect. The taint of witchcraft was believed to be hereditary, a stain that could not be washed away. Entire families were ostracized, their homes and fields falling into ruin, their names becoming synonymous with evil. The simple act of healing, my former trade, became the most dangerous profession of all. Any knowledge of herbs, any skill in midwifery, any traditional wisdom passed down through generations was now seen as definitive proof of a pact with the devil. The women who had once been the pillars of the community, the keepers of its health and life, were now the first to be suspected. Their knowledge was their crime. In this new world, ignorance was safety. To know nothing, to see nothing, to say nothing, that was the path of survival. People learned to avert their eyes, to pretend not to hear the screams from the interrogation room, to walk past the homes of the accused as if they were already empty. Apathy became a virtue, and cowardice a survival strategy. The moral compass of the village was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The land itself seemed to sigh under the weight of it all. Fields lay fallow because the family that worked them had been taken. Homes stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes. The laughter of children was seldom heard. The very air seemed to crackle with a low-grade constant dread. The village was committing suicide, one accusation at a time, convinced it was merely curing a disease. The irony was that in their frantic hunt to expel the devil from Oakhaven, they had invited him into every single home. He wasn't in my herbs or in the strange marks on our skin. He was in the envious heart of the farmer, in the bitter soul of the spurned lover, in the greedy eyes of the land-grabber, and in the terrified silence of the good people who did nothing. They had looked for a monster in their midst, and failing to find one, had decided to create their own. This is the ultimate legacy of the Burning Times. It was not just a war on a handful of accused witches, it was a war on trust. It was a war on community. It was the systematic dismantling of the social bonds that hold us together, proving that the most terrifying demons are not the ones we imagine in the dark, but the ones we live with every day, dormant within ourselves, just waiting for the right excuse to emerge. They sought to purify their world with fire, but they only succeeded in burning away their own humanity. They were so afraid of the evil they imagined that they became blind to the real evil they were committing. They sacrificed their neighbors to appease a phantom, only to find themselves living in a world of ghosts, haunted by the faces of those they had betrayed. The great social breakdown did not happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping decay, a death by 1,000 cuts, a suspicious glance here, a whispered rumor there, an accusation here, a conviction there. Each one a small, seemingly insignificant act, but together they unraveled the entire tapestry of a community, leaving nothing but loose, frayed threads. And in the end, what was accomplished? Was the milk any sweeter? Were the crops any richer? Was the village any safer? Of course not. All that was left was a hollowed-out community populated by people who were afraid to look each other in the eye, forever wondering who would be next. They had traded their community for a false sense of security, and in doing so had lost both. This descent into madness, this implosion of a community under the weight of its own fear, is a story that repeats itself. The names change, the accusations are modernized, but the pattern remains. It is a cautionary tale written in the ashes of the innocent, a warning that the first and most important thing we sacrifice in a panic is each other. Don't let these desperate cries for sanity, these echoes from a time when neighbors turned on neighbors, fade into the static of history. Don't let the lessons paid for in blood be forgotten. If you believe we must remember how easily communities can be broken, hit that subscribe button now. Strike the bell icon as a warning against the madness, and ensure that these voices from the fire continue to be heard. After the verdict comes the negotiation. It is not a negotiation for your life, you understand. That ship has most assuredly sailed, caught fire, and sunk. No, this is a negotiation for the quality of your death, and for the state of your immortal soul, a property you are assured is in dire need of spiritual renovation. A priest, his face a carefully constructed mask of gentle concern, arrives in your cell. He doesn't speak of the pyre just yet. He speaks of mercy, of forgiveness, of a final chance at redemption. He is a salesman, and his product is hope, a commodity in very short supply. The offer is tempting in its simplicity. All they require is a full and sincere confession, a public renunciation of the dark arts you never practiced, and, of course, a comprehensive list of your colleagues in wickedness. Do this, the priest murmurs, and the church, in its infinite compassion, can act on your behalf. They can save your soul from eternal damnation. He doesn't explicitly mention what will happen to your body, but he lets the hope of a less agonizing end dangle in the air like a ripe, tantalizing fruit. Perhaps a quick strangling before the flames get too high. A small mercy, but when you're choosing between agony and slightly less agony, it feels like winning the lottery. This is the final, most elegant turn of the screw. They have broken your body, dismantled your reputation, and stolen your life. Now they have come for your integrity. They want you to willingly participate in your own destruction, to co-sign the lies they have written about you. They want you to become their star witness, the final, irrefutable proof that their entire grotesque enterprise was justified. Your confession is not for you. It is for them. It is the final seal on their paperwork, the closing argument in their case against truth itself. The dilemma is a masterpiece of cruelty. You can hold out, maintain your innocence with your last ragged breaths. This path involves more sessions with the man who asks the questions, more intimate conversations with the rack and the boot. Or you can give them what they want. You can sing the song they've written, play the part of the redeemed sinner. It feels like a small victory, a tiny surrender, a way to make the pain stop. You tell yourself it's a strategic retreat. You tell yourself that a few more lies don't matter at this point. But the lies do matter, because they don't just want you to confess, they want you to renounce. This is a formal public affair, a piece of theatre where you are the lead actor. You must stand before the same crowd that condemned you and perform your repentance. You must weep, you must beg for forgiveness, you must theatrically reject the handsome devil you supposedly cavorted with. It is the ultimate act of self-abasement, a final public stripping of any dignity you had left. And then comes the cruelest demand of all, the names. Your mercy has a price, and that price is the lives of others. The priest will lean in, his breath smelling of onions and piety, and he will press you for your accomplices. Who danced with you at the Sabbat, my child? Who stirred the cauldron? God's forgiveness is boundless, but it requires a full accounting. They want you to become the contagion, to spread the sickness of accusation with your own tongue. To save yourself from an hour of pain, you must condemn your friends to the same fate. This is the moment the last of your hope dies. You realize it was never about your soul. It was about recruitment. They want you to become a witch finder yourself, to provide them with a fresh list of victims for the next round of trials. Your confession is the seed from which a whole new forest of pyres will grow. You are being asked not just to die, but to become a weapon in their war on sanity, your last words twisted into ammunition. So you begin the grim calculus. Who do you name? The dead are a safe bet. You name old Agnes, who died of the winter flu 5 years ago. The priest smiles, but he is not satisfied. And who among the living, my child? You name the man who moved away to the city, the family that vanished last spring. He shakes his head gently. Who here? Who in this village? He needs fresh meat, local meat, and you are the butcher, forced to choose the next lamb for the slaughter. In the end, worn down by a weariness that goes deeper than bone, you give in. You whisper a name, perhaps the name of the woman you always envied, or the man who was cruel to you, or perhaps, in a final act of despair, you whisper the name of the person you love most in the world, because in the upside-down logic of this nightmare, nothing makes sense anymore. You have given them what they want. You have paid the price. You have purchased your mercy. The day of the execution arrives. You are led back to the town square. You feel strangely calm, hollowed out. You have already died a dozen times in that cell. You perform your renunciation. You read the script they have written for you, your voice a dead monotone. You renounce the moon, the stars, the herbs of the field, and a long list of demons with frankly ridiculous names. The crowd seems moved by your performance. The judges nod gravely, their faces full of solemn satisfaction. The dreary days after the... Then the lead judge announces the sentence. He speaks of your sincere repentance, your heartfelt confession. He praises you for renouncing the devil and aiding the court. He speaks of the Church's infinite mercy. And therefore he declares, your sentence has been commuted. You will not be burned alive as a defiant witch. You will be granted the mercy of the garrote. You will be strangled to death first, and then your soulless body will be burned to ashes, as is fitting for your crime. Then that's when you realize it was all for nothing. The confession, the renunciation, the terrible soul-destroying act of naming others. It was all just a negotiation over the precise method of your murder. You haven't saved your life, you've just edited the final scene of your own snuff play. Then it just feels like you've wasted good screaming. The hope they sold you was a phantom, a cruel joke whispered in the dark. The final insult is that your words will outlive you. Your forced confession, born of agony and false hope, will be entered into the official record. It will be held up as proof. It will be read at other trials, used as a textbook to instruct new witch-finders. Your lies will become their truth. Your weakest moment will become their strongest weapon. You will be remembered not as a victim but as a confessed and repentant witch, a validation of the very system that murdered you. They did not just kill you, they erased you. They replaced the real you with a fictional character of their own creation, and they forced you to animate that character with your final breaths. They made you haunt your own legacy, your own voice twisted to condemn others long after you are gone. It is a victory so total, so absolute, that the devil himself would surely take notes. So you stand at the stake, the rough wood against your back, the executioner fumbling with a rope around your neck. You look out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who will be telling this story for years to come, and they will get it all wrong. They will talk of your wickedness and of your eventual tearful redemption. They will not talk of the thumbscrews or the sleepless nights, or the false promises of a man in a black robe. Your true story, the one where you were an innocent person caught in a machine of horrific stupidity, will die with you. It will turn to smoke and ash and scatter on the wind, unheard, unrecorded, and unknown. All that will remain is the fiction, the useful, tidy lie that keeps the machine running smoothly. It's the perfect crime. And as the rope tightens, you have one last fleeting thought. You hope that someday someone will dig through the ashes and the lies. Someone will see the faint outline of the truth behind the monstrous caricature. Someone will understand that the confession was not a victory for God, but a triumph of pain and despair. You hope that your silence, the real you, is louder than the words they forced you to say. The dilemma of confession was never a choice between life and death. It was a choice between a quick death and a slow one, between dying with your integrity intact or dying as a tool of your destroyers. Most chose the former, not out of weakness, but out of a desperate human need for the pain to stop. It's a choice no one should ever have to make. The system was designed to make martyrs impossible. A martyr dies for a cause, defiant and noble, but a confessed and repentant witch, she just dies because she was guilty. Her death proves nothing, questions nothing, it simply affirms the status quo. The confession was the ultimate tool for neutralizing dissent, for turning a victim into an accomplice. So when you read the records of the trials, when you see the detailed confessions full of vivid, lurid details, remember where they came from. They are not historical accounts of witchcraft. They are literary works, ghost-written by torturers and dictated by the agonized and the hopeless. They are monuments to the power of pain to reshape reality. They tell you that a witch cannot weep, but in that final moment, as you renounce a life you loved and a world that has betrayed you, the tears are real. They are not tears of repentance. They are tears of rage, of grief, of a sorrow so profound it could drown the world. And they are the last true thing you have left to give. This is the nature of futile hope. It is a crueler torture than any iron boot. It makes you complicit in your own demise. It makes you betray everything you hold dear for a prize that was never real. It is the final, mocking laugh of a system that has thought of everything. If the echoes of these wasted words, these confessions bartered for a mercy that never came, still ring in your ears, then our broadcast is reaching you. Do not let their final, coerced testimony be the last word. To honor the silence behind the screaming, to give a voice to the truth that was tortured into oblivion, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell, and let it toll for all the futile hopes and the lies that were forced into history. The final day has a carnival atmosphere. The sun, with a stunning lack of irony, is shining brightly. From my cell I can hear the sounds of a crowd gathering, not the angry mob of the accusation, but something more festive. There is a buzz of excitement, the sound of anticipation. Children are laughing. Someone is selling meat pies near the town square, their aroma mingling with the scent of freshly cut wood. My execution, it seems, is the most exciting thing to happen in Oakhaven since the last execution. It's good to feel like you're bringing the community together one last time. My final walk is a short one, but it feels like a grand procession. The guards lead me through the throng of people who part like a sluggish sea. They don't shout insults anymore, they just stare, their eyes wide with a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and a palpable sense of relief that it is me and not them, walking towards the tall wooden post in the center of the square. I am their entertainment, their theological lesson, and their cautionary tale, all rolled into one convenient, soon-to-be incinerated package. And the pyre, my final stage. It's an impressive piece of construction, I must admit. The wood is stacked with a craftsman's precision, dry kindling at the bottom, thicker logs arranged in a neat cone around the central stake. They've even put bundles of straw and pitch-soaked rags in strategic places to ensure a quick and vigorous fire. They are terribly efficient when it comes to murder. You have to admire the attention to detail. This is not just a burning, it is a well-planned, municipally sober barbecue, and I am the guest of honor. I see them all in the crowd. The judges looking solemn and important on their raised platform, the priest clutching his cross, ready to offer one last useless prayer. The good citizens of Oakhaven, my neighbors, my accusers. I see the farmer who wanted my land, the weaver whose grief turned to malice, the young man whose pride I wounded. They are all here, their faces upturned, waiting for the show to begin. They need to see this through, to watch the final punctuation mark be placed on their story of my guilt. They tie me to the stake. The ropes are rough, the wood hard against my back. The executioner is a professional, his movements quick and impersonal. He is just doing a job. He avoids my eyes. Perhaps he feels a flicker of shame, or perhaps he's just thinking about the ale he'll have when this is all over. As he works, the priest steps forward to address the crowd, his voice ringing with sanctimonious piety. He speaks of the cleansing power of fire, of purging the community of evil, of saving my blackened soul through this final, painful baptism. They say the fire cleanses the soul. I say it mostly just smells of roasting pork, a very poor substitute for justice. The priest drones on, but I am no longer listening. I am watching a small bird land on the roof of the bakery. It sings a few notes, utterly oblivious to the grim human drama unfolding below. It is the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I have ever seen. The world is full of such simple, stupid beauty, and I am about to be burned out of it for crimes I did not commit, based on evidence that does not exist. If I was granted the mercy of the garrote, the executioner steps forward again. He places a rope or sometimes an iron collar with a screw around my neck. It is a clumsy, intimate moment. He tightens it, and the world begins to narrow to a pinpoint of light. There is a crack, a final sharp pain, and then, not darkness, but a strange detachment. My body is now just a thing, a sack of meat and bone that they can do with as they please. My spirit, my real self, is already somewhere else, a spectator at my own demise. The torch is brought forward. A hush falls over the crowd, a collective intake of breath. The torch-bearer, a man of some local importance, touches the flame to the kindling. It catches with a soft whoosh. For a moment nothing happens. Then a thin white finger of smoke rises into the blue sky. The crowd exhales, a soft, satisfied sigh. The performance has begun on schedule. There will be no refunds. The first thing you notice is the smoke. It's a bitter, acrid thing that claws at your throat and makes your eyes stream. It is not the clean, honest smoke of a hearth fire. It is the smoke of pitch and damnation, and it chokes you long before the flames can reach you. They say it is the devil finally leaving the body expelled by the holy fire. I think it is just the smell of cheap wet kindling and institutionalized murder. Then comes the heat. It starts as a gentle warmth, a pleasant sensation on a cool morning. But it grows with terrifying speed into a blistering, all-consuming wave. It feels like the sun has descended from the sky to sit on your lap. Your skin tightens, blisters and blackens. Your hair vanishes in a sudden silent flash. The world dissolves into a shimmering orange haze. It is a heat that melts not just your flesh, but your thoughts, your memories, your very sense of self. The pain is a revelation. It is a thing so vast, so absolute, that it transcends all other sensations. It is a white roaring noise that fills the universe. It is not the sharp, localized pain of the rack or the thumbscrew. It is a total, immersive agony that redefines the very meaning of existence. In the face of such pain, your life, your innocence, your identity, all of it becomes a distant, irrelevant memory. There is only the fire. I try to hold on to a final thought, a final act of defiance. I try to mock them in my head, to observe the absurdity of it all. I look at the faces in the crowd, their features distorted by the rising heat. I see not piety, but a primal, hypnotic fascination. They are not thinking of God or the devil. They are simply mesmerized by the fire, by the raw, destructive power of it all. They are children staring at a bonfire, their souls empty, their eyes reflecting the flames that are consuming me. This is not a purification. It is a sacrifice, a human sacrifice to the god of fear. They are not cleansing their community, they are merely feeding their own darkest impulses. They are convincing themselves that by destroying me, they are destroying their own problems, their own anxieties. But the fear will not die with me. It will still be there tomorrow when they wake up and need to find someone new to blame. The flames are a symphony of color, orange, yellow, red, even blue, where the pitch burns hottest. It is almost beautiful, in a terrible, apocalyptic way. My body is the canvas, and the fire is the artist, painting a masterpiece of destruction. My nerves are screaming, but my mind is strangely distant now, a passenger on a ship of unbearable light. The world is reduced to a single roaring point. My final coherent thought is one of profound, cosmic disappointment. Not just in my accusers, but in the whole shoddy design of the world. A world where truth is so fragile and lies are so robust. A world where kindness is a weakness and cruelty a virtue. A world that would rather burn a healer than admit that sometimes cows just get sick and harvests just fail. It is a world that is not worthy of that small bird singing on the rooftop. And then, nothing. The pain ends, the noise ceases, the light fades. There is only a great, silent, and profound stillness. The broadcast is over, the signal is lost. All that is left is the smoke, rising to the heavens, carrying the story of a woman who was murdered by her own community because they were afraid of the dark. The crowd watches until the end. They stay until the pyre collapses into a heap of glowing embers. They watch until my body is no longer recognizable as human, until it is just a blackened, charred thing at the core of the ashes. Then they will turn and go home, their souls purified, their children clutching their hands, full of a lesson they will never truly understand. They will have a good meal and sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that justice has been done. The executioner will later rake through the ashes. He will collect any remaining bones and crush them into dust, to be scattered in a river or thrown to the winds. No trace of the witch must remain. No grave, no marker, no place for memory to take root. They want to erase me not just from life, but from the earth itself. It is the final act of a cowardice so profound it borders on the sublime. The fire did not cleanse my soul. It revealed the state of theirs. In the light of my burning, the true nature of Oakhaven was laid bare. It was a community that had chosen fear over reason, superstition over compassion, and spectacle over justice. And that is a stain that no fire can ever burn away. It will linger in their hearts, a cold spot that no hearth can ever truly warm. My final words were never spoken. They were screamed into a roaring inferno unheard by any ear save for God's, and I have my doubts about his attentiveness of late. But my final thoughts, these echoes you are receiving, are the real testimony, the story of a woman who loved the earth and was killed by the people she tried to heal. This is the end of my story, but it is not the end of the broadcast. The fear that built my pyre is a fire that has never truly gone out. It smoulders in the dark corners of the human heart, waiting for the right wind to fan it into a new and terrible flame. And it is your task, you who are listening in the quiet of a future I cannot imagine, to ensure it never does. If this broadcast from the flames has reached you, if you have felt the heat and smelled the smoke and understood the terrible farcical tragedy of it all, then our efforts have not been in vain. Support our ongoing purification efforts by subscribing to this channel, keep the signal alive, hit the notification bell, like a final, defiant crackle of the fire, and ensure that these final words echo through history, a constant, burning reminder of the cost of fear. Let us speak of the grand fiction, the lurid fantasy I was forced to co-author in the dark of my cell. After the breaking of the body comes the breaking of reality itself. They did not just want a confession of guilt, they wanted a story, a detailed and lurid travelogue of my adventures in damnation. They wanted to know everything about my pact with the devil, and they were more than willing to provide me with all the key plot points. It was a collaborative process, you see. They provided the pain, I provided the punctuation. I'm told I signed a pact with a horned beast, in my own blood no less, I don't recall this event, though my memory of the past few weeks is admittedly a bit hazy, filled as it is with loud noises and a distinct lack of sleep. Perhaps the wine was too strong that night, or maybe I just have a very imaginative interrogator. He seemed quite certain about the details. Apparently, the devil has surprisingly good penmanship, but terrible posture. These are the little things you notice. The devil himself, as described by the experts, is a rather disappointing figure. Not the majestic fallen angel one might expect, but more of a cosmic middle manager. Sometimes he appeared to me, so my confession claims, as a tall man in black with a chilly handshake. Other times he was a large goat who walked on two legs and spoke with a bleating, oddly persuasive voice. The lack of consistency was artistically troubling, but my collaborators in the questioning room were not overly concerned with continuity. My initiation into the world of wickedness apparently involved a formal renunciation of my christening. I was taken to a crossroads at midnight, a classic, if somewhat cliché, setting, where I was instructed to trample a crucifix and pledge my eternal allegiance to my new, poorly postured lord. I also had to promise to dedicate myself to a life of evil, which, according to the charges, mostly involved agricultural vandalism and giving people mild headaches. For an all-powerful Dark Lord, his ambitions seemed remarkably petty. Then came the flying. This is everyone's favorite part. Before you can attend the Grand Sabbat, you must first master the art of aerial navigation. The key, I'm told, is a special flying ointment. The recipe they suggested was a charming concoction of rendered baby fat, wolfsbane, nightshade, and a few other ingredients one doesn't typically find at the local market. You apply this fragrant balm to yourself and your chosen vehicle, which is, of course, a broomstick. A rake or a shovel would also do in a pinch, apparently. My first flight, as I recounted it under some duress, was a wobbly affair. The broomstick has terrible aerodynamics, and the steering is abysmal. I confessed to several crash landings in thorn bushes, and a rather embarrassing incident involving a farmer's thatched roof, before I finally got the hang of it. The wind whips at you, the splinters are a constant menace, and the view is mostly just dark. Frankly, the whole experience seems highly impractical. Walking is underrated. But the destination makes it all worthwhile, or so they say. The Grand Sabbat. This is the main event, the unholy convention where all the devil's followers gather to report on their wicked deeds and engage in some light blasphemy. It's held in a variety of scenic locations, sometimes a desolate mountaintop, other times a dark clearing in the woods. One week, according to my interrogator's notes, we apparently held it in the church graveyard, which strikes me as a needlessly provocative choice of venue. The attendees were a veritable who's who of Oakhaven society. It was quite the revelation to learn that half my neighbors were leading secret double lives. Goody Miller, whose primary concerns in life seemed to be the price of eggs and her rheumatism, was apparently a fearsome sorceress. The quiet, timid baker was a master of demonic incantations. It's always the ones you least suspect. The Sabbat was less a den of terrifying evil and more like the village fair, but with more nudity and significantly worse catering. How the feast, a banquet fit for the damned. My confession included detailed descriptions of the bill of fare. We dined on roasted toads, stewed bats, and a variety of dishes prepared with unbaptized infants as the main ingredient. The bread was black and tasted of ash, and the wine was served in a goat's skull. As a woman who knows her herbs and spices, I must say the culinary standards were abysmal. No amount of demonic power, it seems, can compensate for a poor chef. After dinner comes the ceremony. This is the centerpiece of the evening, the Black Mass. It is, in essence, a direct parody of the Christian service, reimagined by someone with a deep-seated fear of fun and a flair for the dramatic. Prayers are said backwards, which is not so much evil as it is difficult to memorize. The crucifix is used for a variety of purposes for which it was not designed, and there is a great deal of enthusiastic kneeling before the master of ceremonies. The climax of the ritual is the infamous osculum infame, the kiss of shame. This is where all the attendees line up to pay homage to the devil by kissing his posterior. My confession included a vivid description of this degrading and profoundly unhygienic act. All I can say is that for a being of immense power and pride, the devil seems to have a rather desperate need for validation. It's all a bit sad, really. As a reward for our loyalty, we were each assigned a familiar, a small demon in animal form to act as our assistant and confidant. I was apparently given a grumpy, one-eyed toad named Pustule, who was tasked with helping me curdle milk and find lost socks. He was, according to my testimony, lazy, difficult to house-train, and offered terrible advice. My career in evil was clearly being hampered by incompetent demonic staff. And what did we do with all this power? What grand works of evil did we accomplish after flying hundreds of miles and feasting on ash bread? We made our neighbors' cows sick. We caused milk to sour. We raised small, localized hailstorms to ruin a particularly nice patch of cabbage. It's a staggering misuse of supernatural resources. To go to all the trouble of making a pact with the Lord of Darkness simply to engage in petty agricultural sabotage feels like a profound failure of imagination. The entire fiction is riddled with such contradictions. One week the devil is a charming man in velvet, the next he is a slobbering beast. The location of the Sabbat changes based on the interrogator's whim. The details are a messy, incoherent patchwork, stitched together from folk tales, theological treatises, and the fevered, misogynistic nightmares of celibate monks. They weren't discovering a secret world, they were creating one, and forcing us to populate it. They would ask leading questions, and my pain-addled mind would grasp at them like a drowning man grasping at thorns. Did you not see Goody Miller at the Sabbat? Yes, she was there. Was she not the one who suggested poisoning the well? Of course, it was her idea. My confession was not my story. It was an echo of their questions, a desperate attempt to give them the answers that would make them stop. And the most terrifying part? They believed it. They believed it with every fiber of their being. They would listen to these tales of flying goats and toad familiars, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and righteous fury. They saw this lurid fantasy not as a symptom of their own cruelty, but as a literal, factual account of my life. The line between their imagination and my reality had been completely erased, and I was trapped in the smoldering wreckage. This entire theological farce, this grand operatic narrative of my secret life, was constructed for one reason: to make my death meaningful to them. It is not enough to kill a woman for knowing about herbs, but to kill a woman who flew on a broomstick, kissed the devil's hindquarters, and blighted crops with a glance, that is not murder, that is a holy crusade. They had to invent a monster worthy of their fire. The details are what make it so absurdly tragic. They worried about the specific wording of the pact, the precise ingredients of the ointment, the proper demonic etiquette at a Sabbat. They built a complex, detailed, and utterly insane alternate reality, and then they murdered people for failing to live up to its fictional standards. It would be hilarious if the consequences weren't so permanent. So when you hear the stories, when you read the confessions, remember what they are. They are not the truth. They are the ravings of a fever, the desperate fictions of the tortured, the shared delusion of a world that had gone mad. They are the ultimate proof that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones with horns and pitchforks, but the ones who carry big books and ask all the wrong questions. My real pact was not with a demon, but with the earth. My real rituals were not blasphemous masses, but the quiet turning of the seasons. My only real magic was the knowledge of which root could soothe a fever and which leaf could ease a pain. And for that I was made to confess to a life of cartoon villainy and then burned alive. The absurdity is the cruelest part of all. They gave me a secret life far more exciting than my real one. According to them, I was a powerful sorceress, a consort of demons, a key player in a cosmic war. In reality, I was just a woman who was good with plants and preferred her own company. I suppose I should be flattered by the upgrade, but the retirement benefits are terrible. This entire chapter of history is a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing your own fiction. They wrote a story about a vast demonic conspiracy, and then they tortured and killed people until they found enough actors to play all the parts. It was a play written, produced, and directed by madmen, and the price of a ticket was your life. If you find this theological farce, this grand, gory, and utterly nonsensical drama to be as compelling as it is horrifying, then you understand the nature of this broadcast. We are peeling back the curtain on the worst written play in history. So please, subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell to ensure you have a front row seat for every act of this absurd tragedy. Don't let the critics have the final say. The priests, they were meant to be our shepherds, the gentle guides for our flock. In the quiet times, their sermons were soft and predictable, full of parables about lost sheep and forgiving fathers. They spoke of love, of compassion, of turning the other cheek. Their words were a warm, if slightly dull, blanket against the cold hardships of our lives. But when the first whispers of fear began to circulate, the shepherd's crook started to look remarkably like a hunter's club. The sermons changed and the flock began to look a lot like a pack of wolves. The shift was subtle at first. The sermons became less about forgiveness and more about vigilance. The devil, once a distant, almost allegorical figure, was suddenly promoted to a clear and present danger, an active agent lurking in our very village. He was in our homes, at our tables, and, most alarmingly, in our neighbors. The gentle shepherd started to spend a great deal of time describing the wolf, its cunning, its hunger, its many disguises. He didn't name the wolf, but he painted such a vivid picture that we all started seeing it in the shadows of each other's faces. Then they found their charter, their divine permission slip for the madness that was to come. A single, convenient line from an old book, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Suddenly, this became the most important sentence ever written. All the other, more difficult commandments about loving your neighbor, not bearing false witness, not coveting their goods, were quietly shuffled to the back of the book. This one line, sharp and hard and absolute, was all the theology they needed. It was the rock upon which they would build their church of fear. The priests preach of love and forgiveness. Then they light the pyre. It's very confusing. I've searched my memory of their sermons for the theological fine print. Perhaps love thy neighbor has an asterisk I missed. Usually you find it next to a clause that reads, terms and conditions apply, or unless they talk to cats. It seems the love of God is unconditional, but the love of his earthly representatives comes with a long list of exceptions, chief among them being a suspicious knowledge of herbal remedies. When the professional inquisitors arrived, they brought with them a whole library of justifications. These were not simple village priests. They were scholars of sin, academics of agony. They could quote chapter and verse to defend the use of the rack. They could cite esteemed theologians to explain why a confession extracted through torture was not only valid, but divinely inspired. They had constructed a magnificent, airtight cathedral of logic to house their cruelty, and its foundations were built on the selective reading of holy texts. Their masterstroke was the concept of mercy. They weren't murdering me, they were saving me. The fire was not an execution, it was a purification. My body, they explained with unnerving sincerity, was merely a vessel, a tainted clay pot that had to be shattered to release my immortal soul from the devil's grasp. They were performing a painful, but ultimately loving act of spiritual surgery. It is a testament to their rhetorical skill that they could describe the act of burning a woman alive as a form of celestial therapy. The devil's greatest trick, the priests often said, was convincing the world he didn't exist. A clever line, but I have a counter-proposal. The devil's greatest trick was convincing the men of God that they were doing his work while they were in fact doing the devil's own. He simply subcontracted. He didn't need to build the pyres himself. He had a legion of eager volunteers in black robes, all convinced they were soldiers of light, all armed with his own favorite tools, fear, piety, and self-righteousness. But were they all so convinced? Was there no dissenting voice in the holy chorus? I remember a young monk who passed through Oakhaven, his face pale and his eyes full of a troubled intelligence. He watched my trial from the back of the crowd, and I saw him flinch when the pricker brandished his needle. He did not join in the cheers when the verdict was read. He looked not triumphant, but ill. He was a shepherd who seemed to remember that his job was to protect the sheep, not to help the wolves butcher them. This young man made the mistake of voicing his doubts to the local priest over a cup of watered-down ale. He quietly questioned the use of spectral evidence. He wondered if a confession made after 3 days of sleeplessness and the strappado could truly be considered voluntary. He suggested that perhaps the devil's influence was being overstated, and that simple misfortune was being misdiagnosed as demonic assault. He spoke of reason, of compassion, of the very Christ they all claimed to serve. The response was swift and predictable. The young monk's questions were not seen as a sign of a healthy conscience, but as a symptom of a weak faith. His compassion for my plight was twisted into sympathy for the devil. He was subtly, and then not so subtly, accused of being a heretic himself, a wolf in sheep's clothing sent to undermine their holy work. He left the village before dawn the next day, his questions unanswered, and his faith likely shaken to its very foundation. The system did not tolerate internal review. And so the question must be asked, were they shepherds or hunters? A shepherd protects his entire flock, even the difficult, the sickly, or the strange ones. A hunter moves through the flock and culls the ones he deems undesirable, the ones that don't fit, the ones whose removal serves his own purposes. When the men of God began to look at their congregations and see not souls to be saved but witches to be burned, the answer becomes painfully clear. They had traded their crooks for spears. The clergy provided the moral framework for the entire operation. They were the ones who assured the common folk that their fear was righteous. They were the ones who told the judges and executioners that their cruelty was a form of piety. They washed the blood off the hands of the state with the holy water of their doctrine. They turned a brutal campaign of social cleansing into a holy war, and in doing so, they gave everyone permission to indulge their worst impulses. It was a perfect partnership. The secular authorities had the power to arrest, to torture, and to kill. The religious authorities had the power to make it all feel like God's will. One hand held the sword, the other held the cross, and together they became an unstoppable force. They created a world where the most loving act you could perform for your neighbor was to report them for witchcraft and ensure their soul was saved by the flame. They spoke of the devil as a great deceiver, a master of lies, and yet their entire case against me was built on a confession they themselves had scripted and forced me to recite. They condemned me based on lies they had manufactured, while accusing me of being an agent of the father of lies. The hypocrisy is so dense, so profound, it is almost a physical presence in the air. It is the one true spectre that haunts this whole sorry affair. I often wonder if they believed their own sermons. Did the priest who watched me burn truly believe he was saving my soul? Did the inquisitor who listened to my screams truly believe he was hearing the voice of God? Or was it all a performance, a role they played to maintain their power, to control a terrified populace? I suspect the truth is something even more terrifying. They believed it absolutely. There is no cruelty so absolute as the cruelty of the truly righteous. They were fighting a war against a phantom army. They saw a vast international conspiracy of witches, a shadow empire loyal to Satan, threatening to overthrow all of Christendom. And I, a woman who knew how to treat a cough with whorehound, was somehow a high-ranking general in this demonic legion. It is a grand and terrifying fantasy, and they were willing to sacrifice any number of real living people to sustain it. The Bible is a large book, full of contradictions and complexities. It speaks of mercy and vengeance, of love and of wrath. Like a vast forest, you can find in it whatever you are looking for. If you seek justification for kindness, you will find it in abundance. But if you seek justification for hatred, for persecution, for the burning of your fellow human beings, you can find that too, if you squint hard enough and take a few key lines out of context. They were excellent squinters. They were not all monstrous sadists. Many were simply men of their time, trapped in a worldview that was drenched in superstition and a deep-seated fear of chaos. They believed the world was a battlefield between God and Satan, and they were the soldiers on the front lines. They saw what they had been trained to see, and they acted accordingly. They were men who had mistaken their own fear for faith. But intention is a poor defense against a charge of atrocity. The path to my pyre was paved with their good intentions, each step, from the first sermon that planted the seed of fear to the final prayer that sanctified the flame, was taken by men who believed they were doing the right thing. It is a chilling reminder that the greatest evils are often committed not by villains, but by ordinary people who are absolutely certain they are on the side of the angels. So let us remember the shepherds who became hunters, Let us remember the men who preached of a loving God and then held the torch to the pyre. Let us remember how easily faith can be twisted into a weapon, how easily Scripture can be edited to serve a cruel agenda. Their legacy is a warning, a grim lesson written in smoke and ash. They promised us salvation and gave us a bonfire. They promised us the love of God and showed us the hatred of men. They were the moral compass of our community, and they pointed us all directly towards hell, assuring us it was the way to heaven. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust, the ultimate perversion of faith. And in the end, I pity them. I pity their small, fearful hearts. I pity their need to create monsters so they could feel like heroes. I pity them for the world they built, a world where God was a terrifying tyrant and the devil was the only one who seemed to be having any fun. It must be a terrible thing to live inside a mind like that. If you believe these grim lessons are worth learning, if you feel that understanding the failures of the past is the only way to protect the future, then keep this broadcast alive. The shepherds are still out there, and they are always watching their flock, deciding who is a sheep and who is a wolf. Like this record of our past, subscribe to ensure you never miss a warning. The fire is out. The smoke has cleared, clinging to the rooftops and the memory of the village like a stubborn ghost. The crowd has dispersed, returning to their homes, their minds full of the spectacle and their bellies full of the pies they bought in the square. The inquisitors and judges have packed their books and their righteousness and moved on to the next town, the next pyre. Oakhaven has been purified, it has been saved, and now a great and terrible silence settles over the land. This is the aftermath, the quiet part after the screaming stops. The village won its great victory against the legions of hell, but no one is celebrating. There is a hollowness in the air, a shared, unspoken shame. The bonds of trust, once as strong and reliable as a well-ploughed field, have been burned to ash. Neighbor looks upon neighbor not with familiarity, but with a new, guarded weariness. They are all survivors of a war they waged against themselves, and the scars are on every face. The fear, you see, does not burn. It is not flammable. The fire consumes the accused, but it feeds the fear, makes it stronger, more real. Before, the devil was a story. Now they have seen his work firsthand. They have seen a witch confess. They have seen the cleansing fire. The threat is no longer a suspicion. It is a proven fact, a confirmed reality. They have not banished the darkness. They have simply invited it inside to stay. Life in Oakhaven attempts to return to normal, but it is a new, twisted kind of normal. The farmer, whose accusation won him the disputed land, now ploughs his new field under the silent gaze of his ruined neighbor's children. The woman who testified against her rival now sees that rival's grieving husband every day in the market. They are forever bound together by the betrayal, tied by a knot of guilt and resentment that will never come undone. There is no peace, only a quiet, simmering continuation of the war by other means. And what of my trade? What of the ancient knowledge of herbs and healing that has been tainted forever? I was the healer, the midwife, the woman who knew the secrets of the earth, and I was a witch. The two things are now inextricably linked in the village's mind. The next woman who offers a poultice for a wound or a tea for a fever will be met not with gratitude, but with suspicion. The knowledge that kept them alive for centuries is now a forbidden art. In their fervor to eliminate the imaginary threat of witchcraft, they have crippled themselves in very real ways. Who will deliver the babies now that the midwife's knowledge is considered diabolical? Who will treat the colic, the flux, the ague? They have traded their healers for witch-finders, their remedies for prayers. They will pay for their purity with the lives of their own children, a far higher price than any tithe the devil might have demanded. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. The witch hunts were a force of profound social change, an engine of regression. They particularly targeted women who lived outside the narrow confines of patriarchal control. The independent woman, the childless widow, the knowledgeable elder, the skilled healer, these were the women who were most vulnerable. The hunts were a brutal, effective way of forcing women back into a state of silent, powerless submission. A woman with knowledge is a threat. A woman with opinions is a danger. That was the grim lesson taught by the fire. And so, the generations that followed were taught to be smaller. Women learned to hide their intelligence, to distrust their own wisdom. They were taught that curiosity was a sin and that obedience was their highest virtue. The fear of being labeled a witch became a cage, a prison built of superstition and shame. The pyres may have burned out, but the chilling effect of their smoke would linger for centuries, stunting the growth of half the population. The great burning times eventually faded, not always because of a sudden dawn of enlightenment, but for more practical reasons. Sometimes the accusations simply became too costly, bankrupting towns with the expenses of trials and executions. Sometimes the accusations started to climb too high up the social ladder. When a powerful man's wife or daughter was accused, that man suddenly developed a very keen interest in the rules of evidence and the unreliability of confessions extracted through torture. And then there was the slow, creeping dawn of a new kind of belief, science. A new set of men in robes, this time the robes of the academic and the physician, began to offer alternative explanations. A blight on the crops was not a hex, it was a fungus. A sickness in the village was not a curse, it was a contagion carried in the water. They replaced the devil with germs, demons with diseases. It was a new kind of faith, one based on observation and evidence. But do not be so sure that this new faith is free of its own arrogance and its own superstitions. It brought with it a cold, clinical view of the world that often dismissed the wisdom of the old ways entirely. My knowledge of herbs was not just demonic, it was now unscientific, the babbling of an ignorant peasant. They replaced one form of dogma with another, and in the process much was lost. The world was explained, but some of its magic, the real magic of the living earth, was explained away. The shadow of the witch, however, never truly disappeared. It lingers in our language, in our stories, in our collective unconscious. The word itself remains a potent weapon, a way to label and dismiss any woman who is deemed too powerful, too angry, too independent, too loud. The archetype of the wicked witch, the evil crone, the manipulative seductress, these are the ghosts born from the smoke of the pyres, and they still haunt us. And the pattern repeats. The names change, but the melody of fear remains the same. The hunt for witches becomes the hunt for heretics, for traitors, for subversives, for immigrants, for anyone who can be easily labeled as other. The machinery of panic, once perfected, is too useful a tool to be left to rust. Whenever times are hard, whenever people are scared, the search for a scapegoat begins anew. The pyre is rebuilt, metaphorically or literally, and a new victim is chosen. Look back at Oakhaven. A century later, the story of Elara the witch has become a local ghost story, a tale to frighten children into behaving. Be good, or the witch of the woods will get you. The real me, the woman who loved the scent of rain on dry earth and the taste of wild strawberries, is gone. I have been replaced by a caricature, a monster of their own making. My memory has been co-opted into the very system of superstition and fear that destroyed me. And what of the knowledge that this was all a terrible mistake? That, too, is a slow and difficult dawning. Generations later, scholars will read the trial records. They will note the flimsy evidence, the coerced confessions, the leading questions. They will see the madness for what it was. They will write books and articles expressing their shock and dismay. They will use my story and the stories of thousands like me as a lesson for their own time. They will try to understand how it could have happened. How could entire communities, entire nations, be swept up in such a deadly delusion? They will talk of social pressures, of economic anxieties, of political instability, of religious fervor. They will have many complex and intelligent explanations, but they will all miss the simplest truth. It happened because people were afraid, and fear is a more powerful god than love or reason. My broadcast, this Echo from the Flames, is my final attempt to set the record straight. To tell you that the witches were not real, but the hunts were. The demons were not real, but the cruelty was. The devil's pact was not real, but the betrayal of neighbor by neighbor most certainly was. The magic was not in my herbs, but in the terrifying power of collective belief to reshape the world into a nightmare. Do not think that your time is so different. Do not believe that your world is too rational, too advanced to fall into a similar madness. Your fears are different. Your devils wear new masks. But the human heart that beats with terror is the same. The instinct to find someone to blame, to purify the community by casting out the other, is a ghost that is never truly laid to rest. So listen to the silence that follows the scream. Look at the scars left on a community that devoured itself. The smoke will always clear and the ashes will always scatter. But the fear? That lingers. It is a poison in the well of a community's soul, a shadow on every face. It lies dormant, waiting for the next bad harvest, the next plague, the next demagogue, to whisper its name and begin the hunt all over again. The fire has taken my body, but it has not taken my voice. This broadcast is my legacy. It is the final, defiant act of a woman who was silenced, but will not be silent. It is a testament to the truth that even from the heart of the flames, a story can survive, a warning can be sent, an echo can refuse to fade. This is the end of my transmission, but it is not the end of the story. The struggle between fear and reason, between superstition and compassion, is your struggle now. The ashes of my pyre are the soil from which your future will grow. Tend it well. Do not let the weeds of hatred take root. If you are still processing this monumental human struggle, if you feel the weight of these stories and the importance of their lessons, then our broadcast has served its purpose. Do not let the signal die. Be sure to subscribe. Become a keeper of this flame, not the fire of destruction, but the light of remembrance. Keep our voices alive, and ensure that the burning times remain a history and not a prophecy. The roaring fades. The great beastly hunger of the fire is sated, and all that is left is a soft, sighing crackle. The heat dissipates, replaced by a profound and endless cool. There is no pain, there is no body, there is only this: a voice, a thought, an echo caught in the static between worlds, a signal still transmitting long after the station has burned to the ground. This is the aftermath, the quiet that follows the scream, and my final broadcast is about to begin. My bones are ash, my herbs are scattered, my name is a curse whispered to frightened children. They have done their worst, they have erased my body from the earth. And yet, I remain, a stubborn spark of thought, a persistent memory, a voice on the wind, speaking from the heart of the great smoldering silence they have created. So, listen closely, one last time. And so, as my mortal form turns to cinders, and my spirit takes flight, perhaps on a very fast broomstick, who knows? This has been Elara, your humble and currently quite Christy broadcaster from the heart of the burning times. We have journeyed together through the landscape of human fear. We saw how a sick cow could launch an inquisition, how a whispered rumor could become a death sentence. We witnessed the theater of a rigged trial, and felt the cold logic of a torturer's tools. We saw the fear, felt the injustice, and witnessed ignorance consume wisdom. We learned that a community can be made to turn on itself, that neighbor will sell neighbor for a plot of land or a moment of perceived safety. We listened as the shepherds of the soul became the hunters of the flock, twisting faith into a weapon of terrifying efficiency. And we stood together, you and I, before the final purifying fire, and understood its purpose was not to cleanse, but to silence. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the very depths of persecution has given you a moment of profound contemplation, then my purpose is served. If it has made you appreciate your own era's lack of impromptu public burnings and the simple, glorious right to be odd without being declared a diabolical agent, then the agony was not entirely without merit. Hold that appreciation close. It is a fragile, precious thing. Do not be so arrogant as to think these times are entirely behind you. The names of the demons may change, the justifications may be dressed in different robes, but the anatomy of a witch hunt remains remarkably consistent. It requires only two ingredients: a frightened populace and a leader willing to point a finger instead of offering a solution. Look around you. See if you can spot the kindling being gathered. So what is the lesson in all this, Ash? It is that the greatest battle is not between God and the devil, but between wisdom and ignorance, between compassion and fear. It is a battle fought not in the heavens, but in the heart of every person. It is a battle you fight every day, with every choice you make to question, to understand, to trust, or to condemn. Do not falter in that fight. Keep listening not just to me, but to the quiet voices of reason in your own time. Keep questioning, not just the absurdities of the past, but the certainties of your present. And for the sake of all that is true and unspoken, keep that subscribe button pressed. Let it be an act of remembrance, a promise that you will not let these stories turn to smoke, because even when flesh burns, truth, like a persistent ember, remains until the next broadcast. From somewhere far, far cooler. Farewell. A final, soft pop sound, then silence, save for a lingering, faint crackle of embers.